Now, the one thing I like about Gettysburg the most is there's a story for everybody here. Doesn't matter who you are. You can take something from this field and learn from it. You can connect to the personal human stories. You can connect to the battle if you want to. And in the many ways that you can connect to the stories out of here, you can also explore it. If you're not the type of person to get out on the dirty trails and walk around in the hot summer sun or the wet spring or the blistering cold, there's plenty of roads, there's plenty of sidewalks and paths, and there's also plenty of museums. I think it's probably why so many people connect to these fields, because the storytelling out here is the best. It's better than any other field, any other battlefield that I've ever been to.
July 2nd, 1863, marks a dark chapter in American history, one of the bloodiest days of the Battle of Gettysburg. On this fateful day, the air was thick with the cries of battle, as over 100,000 soldiers clashed across the fields, leaving 20,000 of them killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Amongst the turmoil, a modest 19-acre wheat field owned by farmer George Rose would forever be etched in history as the Wheatfield. As the sun climbed high, the afternoon unfolded with relentless charges and countercharges. The landscape became a graveyard, littered with the bodies of over 4,000 fallen soldiers from both sides. Those who fought here later described it as a whirlpool, an unending surge of men rushing forward, then retreating, as if the very ground was alive, flowing with the blood of its warriors. The Wheatfield changed hands 6 times in one tumultuous afternoon, while the surrounding woods provided scant shelter for the Confederate forces as they sought to outmaneuver the Union troops. The ferocious fighting ignited around 4:30 p.m. when Brigadier General George Anderson led his Georgia Brigade out of the woods to the south. They clashed with Union forces under Brigadier General Régis de Trobriand, who had taken a defensive stance behind a stone wall at the southern end of the field. Though outnumbered, de Trobriand's men stood resolute for nearly an hour. But as the last rounds of ammunition were spent, they were forced to retreat across the Wheatfield, pursued eagerly by the Confederates. Yet, in a desperate twist, General David Birney ordered an immediate counterattack. The Union troops, fueled by a fierce determination, charged with bayonets drawn, momentarily halting the Confederate advance. But Anderson's men soon regrouped, and the battle continued to rage as fresh Union reinforcements arrived to bolster the dwindling forces. As chaos engulfed the southern Wheatfield, Union soldiers pushed into the woods to clash with Confederate units advancing from the Rose Farm. For an agonizing hour, Kershaw's brigade of South Carolina fought fiercely against Union troops on a rocky knoll at the west side of the field until they finally forced the defenders to withdraw. Then the renowned Irish Brigade entered the fray, rushing across the Wheatfield to push back the Confederates from the knoll. But Kershaw's men regrouped, bolstered by a Georgia Brigade under Brigadier General Paul Semmes. Semmes attempted to close ranks on Kershaw's right, only to be met by Colonel John Brooks' fresh Union Brigade, which drove them back to the orchards of the Rose Farm. The fighting turned desperate and personal, with hand-to-hand combat erupting as Colonel Harrison Jeffords of the 4th Michigan Infantry rushed to save his regiment's flag, only to be bayoneted. As the dust settled, the Wheatfield became a somber monument to the fallen, echoing with the groans of the wounded and the dying. George Rose's land had transformed into one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of the conflict.
So now we're out here on the Wheatfield, in the middle of it, and it's not a very large field at all. As de Trobriand's men were about to falter and fall back from the fighting that they had done, Zook, Cross, and Kelly come up just in the nick of time, and they make an immediate impact. But as they're over here on these fields, Zook is on his horse, and he's riding up behind his men, and he's hit. He falls from his horse. His men see him fall. They go to aid him, but it's already too late. Zook's mortally wounded. He becomes one of 4 generals out here to die at this battle. That's a pretty distinguished list. But nevertheless, his men fight bravely without him, and they do him justice out here in these fields. Zook, Cross, and Kelly's impact can't be overstated. Their men out here holding this position and keeping the Confederates from sweeping across this field and taking the flank at that moment in time when Mississippi comes up and crushes the peach orchard. Imagine this place falls. It's clear all the way around the side. The Confederates can then wheel again and turn towards the enemies that are fleeing at the peach orchard and sweep that field off in the direction of Cemetery Hill. That would have been a general's dream, but it wasn't to be, because in the position that we're at right now, this hard-fought ground, the many men that died here to keep it, they really saved the day. And they saved the battle over here at the Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and the Round Tops. Somehow that didn't make it into the motion picture.
By 5:30 p.m., Kershaw's troops were advancing on the Rose farmhouse, while Union forces at nearby Stony Hill received much-needed reinforcements. Despite Kershaw's relentless assaults, the Union regiment stood firm until a controversial decision by Barnes led to a withdrawal to a new position near Wheatfield Road, creating an opening for the Confederates to seize Stony Hill and push back into the Wheatfield. At around 6 p.m., Caldwell's division entered the fray, deploying 3 brigades. Zook and Kelly drove the Confederates from Stony Hill, while Cross cleared the Wheatfield, forcing Kershaw's men back into Rose Woods. But the tide turned again as Union positions crumbled in the peach orchard, allowing Confederate forces to advance down Wheatfield Road, enveloping Union troops in a devastating flank. Brooks' brigade retreated from Rose Woods, but Schweitzer's brigade sprang into action, facing the Confederate assault with fierce hand-to-hand combat. The Wheatfield's ownership once again shifted amidst the chaos of war. As fresh Union reinforcements advanced across the ominous Valley of Death, they faced punishing fire from Confederate sharpshooters in Devil's Den. The Confederate forces overwhelmed Stony Hill and Rose Woods, driving 2 newly arrived Union brigades back towards Little Round Top, where they suffered heavy losses, with 829 casualties out of their 2,613 troops. Around 7:30 p.m., the final Confederate assault surged through the Wheatfield, exhausted yet relentless. Anderson, Semmes, and Kershaw's brigades moved forward, but as they reached Little Round Top, they encountered a counterattack from the 3rd Division of the 5th Corps, led by Brigadier General Samuel W. Crawford. Colonel William McCandless's brigade charged bravely, pushing the weary Confederates back past the Wheatfield and reclaiming some measure of control. Realizing the danger of exposure, Crawford ordered a retreat to the Wheatfield's eastern edge, effectively ending further operations in this blood-soaked terrain. As the chaos subsided, the once vibrant Wheatfield fell into an unsettling stillness for the remainder of the battle. But the toll of that day's fighting was catastrophic. The Confederates had engaged 6 brigades, while the Union fielded 13 smaller ones, resulting in approximately 30% casualties among the 20,444 men involved. Wounded soldiers struggled to crawl to Plum Run, only to find the river stained with their blood. Like the infamous cornfield at Antietam, this small stretch of farmland became a symbol of sacrifice and loss, forever ingrained in the memories of the veterans who fought there. The Wheatfield, with its tragic history, remains a testament to the horrors of war, a reminder of the human cost borne on its fields. A quiet field in a small town stands alone with the memories of men that can no longer tell their stories. Many historians have tried to dissect this field and its confusing conflict. One thing has always remained: the actions on this field became a thing of nightmares. This was a place of glory, a place of defeat, and it surely was a place of pain and suffering. Private Jacob Henry Cole, 57th New York, detailed his wounding on July 2nd, 1863 during the fighting in the Wheatfield in his memoir, Under Five Commanders, or A Boy's Experience with the Army of the Potomac. This was his words about that day.
As we pushed forward, a bullet struck my right arm and passed through it. As we charged into the Wheatfield, a shell exploded and shattered my right leg and killed 2 of my comrades. When I was shot in the arm, the feeling was the same as though I had been struck on the elbow. A feeling of numbness came into the arm, and I turned to the comrade by my side and asked him why he had hit me. He said, "I did not hit you, but you have been shot, and you had better go to the rear." I laughed at him and said I was not hurt bad enough to do so. Shortly after, I was injured, as I have mentioned, by the shell. After my leg was shattered, I fell down, laying for a few minutes unconscious, and when I came to my senses, I was surrounded by the enemy.
Today, the Wheatfield is nothing more than a small patch of land with roads intersecting for visitors to drive and enjoy the many monuments that dot the landscape. Time has taken the history from those fields, but it has not moved the spirit. If you stand on that field and let your imagination free, you can still hear the echoes of history from those who no longer speak.
The 97th New York Infantry, along with its brigades, surged into action against the advancing Confederate forces along Oak Ridge on the first day of battle. The men from the Empire State, determined and resolute, loaded and fired their muskets with frantic speed as the intensity of the combat rapidly escalated. Amidst the chaos, the sounds of gunfire and cries of battle filling the air, an officer in Company K stood firm, urging his men on with unwavering resolve. Lieutenant Rush Palmer Cady, in the thick of the fray, called out words of encouragement, his voice rising above the growing clamor. Cady didn't merely lead by words. He also took practical action, helping his soldiers in their most critical moments. As the battle raged on, he moved swiftly through the smoke and chaos, pulling paper cartridges from the ammunition boxes of his men and tearing them open. This saved precious seconds that might otherwise have been lost in the heat of battle. One sergeant, reflecting on the scene, later recalled that Cady remained as cool as nothing but play, despite the enemy's bullets whizzing past them like lightning. Such calmness in the face of danger came natural to Cady, a man whose character had already been forged by discipline and fortitude long before the battle. The eldest son of Daniel and Fidelia Cady, Rush possessed a quiet strength and a methodical approach to life that belied his young age of just 21. The fervor of patriotism that swept through the loyal states at the outbreak of the Civil War stirred something deep within him, compelling him to set aside his academic pursuits at Hamilton College. In early 1862, he answered the call to arms, enlisting in the 97th New York Infantry with the rank of second lieutenant. The regiment soon deployed to Virginia, where it became part of the Army of the Potomac. There, Cady and his comrades proved their mettle in several fierce engagements, including the Second Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Antietam, and the Battle of Fredericksburg. Along the way, Cady's leadership abilities were recognized, and he was promoted to first lieutenant of Company K, further cementing his reputation as a steady and reliable officer in the heat of battle. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the men of the 97th New York Infantry once again proved their courage and valor. During the fierce fighting on the first day, they charged the enemy lines with determination, capturing the colors of North Carolina Regiment and taking many prisoners. But as the Confederate reinforcements arrived and the New Yorkers were forced back, disaster struck. A bullet struck Lieutenant Rush Palmer Cady's right arm, passing through his body and lodging in one of his lungs. The sergeant, who later recounted the incident, recalled that the bullet hit Cady as he was rallying his men. The force of the shot knocked him backwards, and in a pained cry, Cady exclaimed, "Oh, I'm hit." Despite the severity of his injury, Cady remained composed. Some of his men rushed to help him to the rear, stopping briefly to give him a drink of brandy and water. By this time, the tide of battle had turned in favor of the Confederates, and Cady, going faint but still conscious, ordered his men to leave him behind and seek safety. Reluctantly, they obeyed, leaving their officer in a barn on the outskirts of town. The Confederates eventually discovered Cady's location in the barn without hesitation. They paroled him, perhaps too eager to move on to deal with other prisoners or unaware of the severity of his wound. Eventually, Cady made his way to a hospital, where a surgeon confirmed the grim news: the bullet could not be removed. They did what they could to ease his suffering, making him as comfortable as possible, though it was clear his time was running out. Despite the agony, Cady remained remarkably strong in spirit. "I am keeping up good courage. I am in a good place, where my wants are well attended to," he wrote to his family. "How I would like to be received to your arms. Oh, pray for me, Mother, that I may have grace and strength to endure my sufferings patiently." His mother, Fidelia, soon arrived from their home in Rome, New York, staying by his side day and night, her hopes never fully extinguished despite his rapid decline. On July 23rd, she wrote to her husband, "Oh, my husband, can we part with our dear brave boy? May God give us grace to bear all we may be called upon to do. Pray for me and him too, husband, mother, and child. But he may live. We have great hopes yet." Sadly, those hopes were not to be realized. Lieutenant Cady died the next day at 2 p.m. His mother, ever faithful, accompanied his body back to Rome, where he was laid to rest in the family plot at Rome Cemetery. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Many stories are told about the particular units, the massive armies that fought out here. Did you know there's a lot of stories also about premonitions? People predicting their own death out here? Usually, one or two stories come to mind that people talk about because they're the most famous or the most popular stories. And today we're going to share a story with you of a captain that knew he was going to die here at Little Round Top. Three captains were gathered together of the 44th New York, and Lucius Sherman Larrabee was one of them. And they were making small talk before they got their orders to go into battle out here. And as they're making small talk, Lucius has a premonition. It hits him like a bolt of lightning. And he looks very seriously at his other two co-leaders out here on the field. And he asks them, seriously, if they would take his items from him and keep them safe, because he had a feeling he was going to die here on this field. Now, he'd kind of had that premonition since his last real battle, which was at Chancellorsville, and he had spoken often about it, but people back in those days didn't take it serious because you're at war. your odds of dying are pretty good. And even the captains that day told him, hey, look, keep your stuff. We all have the same odds of dying on this field. We'd hate for your stuff to be with us if we died too. So he had to find another way. Now, Captains William Bourne and Ben Kimberly refused to take the man's items. They again insisted, we all got the same odds of dying out here. Keep your stuff, Lucius. Lucius, being extremely desperate, decides he's going to find the quartermaster. And he does. He has a conversation with the quartermaster. The quartermaster is relatively safe. He's back with the wagons issuing out guns, ammunition, equipment, clothes. And he tells him of his premonition and lets him know that he thinks he's going to die and he wants his items sent home. Quartermaster has sympathy this time with him, unlike his co-captains, and he holds on to his items. And then Lucius goes into battle here at Little Round Top. Before the war, Lucius was fairly nomadic. His mother died at the age of 3, when he was at the age of 3. And he had to move in with his sister at the age of 5. He moved from Oneida up to Albany when he made that move. And then a few short years later, he ends up in Chicago, living with his brother who's 12 years older than him at the age of 15. So the man's had a pretty rough life for being only 25 and not really having his parents to watch after him and having to run around from place to place to find a place to live. So you can say he was truly a nomad. But then he gets to Chicago and he finds his calling. And his calling just happens to be with Elmer Ellsworth. In 1859, he joins the Zouave Cadets, led by Elmer Ellsworth. Now, Ellsworth's fame is in Alexandria, Virginia, where he climbs up to the top of a hotel and he yanks down a rebel flag. And by the time he gets down to the bottom of the stairwell, he becomes one of the first real casualties of the war when he takes a rebel civilian bullet to the chest. Ellsworth inspires the 44th New York's coming together. And they're the reason why that unit turns into what it is, really. In 1861, that first unit that he's with is the 11th New York, and he joins as a first lieutenant. Later on, the 11th New York is rolled into the 44th New York as Company B, and in Company B, he rises to the rank of captain, and he ends up out here on this field at Gettysburg, a Little Round Top. Now, if you come out to Little Round Top and you're looking for 44th New York, you can't miss it. It's the thing that looks like a castle on top of Little Round Top. It's quite large. 44th played a crucial role out here, and they wanted to make sure everybody knew it. The monument is outstanding, and you can climb to the top and get a better view of everything down below from that monument. And there's really no better place to tell the story with the battle orientation than right here on top of this monument. Now, for orientation, off down in this direction over here is where the 20th Maine is. The 20th Maine kind of angles down this way and then back like this. Then coming back up in this position over here is the 83rd Pennsylvania. Swinging back in this direction where I'm at right now is the 44th New York. Then the 16th Michigan is off in this direction over here, followed by the 140th New York, the 91st Pennsylvania, the 146th New York, who we talked about in an earlier video, 155th Pennsylvania, and they're all looping back around this direction over here on the top of Little Round Top. And from up here, you can clearly see that outcropping of rocks. That's Devil's Den for reference. The slaughter pen runs down through here. And then the fields that the Confederates are traversing are from across there. You see that tree line off in the distance. They're coming out of that tree line and they're making their way over here. And off in this wooded lot is where 47th Alabama and the 15th Alabama under law are actually coming up this direction. And then you have the 4th Alabama rolling up through here. The 5th Texas, 4th Texas, 48th Alabama, and 44th are off in this direction and then kind of swinging this way as they're coming up towards Hawks Ridge and Devil's Den. Now, Lucius would fight in virtually every major battle along the way that the 44th was involved in, and he would be wounded at the Second Bull Run. When he gets here, he has that premonition, but still, instead of asking to be recused as an officer, he has the courage to go forward and fight with his men, feeling that he knows sudden death is coming. And he gets his men in line and he goes to push them out in a skirmish line because that's what he's been ordered to do. one of the captains looks back at him and says, "Good luck." He looks back to the captain and says, "Goodbye, Billy. I shall never see you again." And the words were true. About 200 yards or so, 20 paces into the fight, Lucius is wounded and he's killed. He dies exactly the way he said he was going to. Sudden and immediate. And his men are left without his captain. There's not much more to say to that. I really can't think of a better place to end a video about Little Round Top than in the shadows of Little Round Top. As you can see off in the distance over here, Little Round Top stands proudly as ever. I'm in the position where Pickett's charge stepped off at, and the Virginia Monument is just in front of me. It's a wonderful place. You should really take care of it and help them here at the park every time you come. Stay on the trails that they've designated for you, and do your best to be good stewards of the history out here and the preservation and the money that's put into this place. I hope you enjoyed the tour of Little Round Top, and I hope you make your way out here and check it out for yourself. But if not, hopefully this gave you everything you needed.
A small group of Georgians swarmed a captured cannon after a short, decisive charge against Union troops along rock-strewn Houck's Ridge during the afternoon of July 2nd. The gun, a 10-pounder Parrott, now belonged to them. One of the soldiers, First Lieutenant Pinky Hatchet, basked in the glory of victory. Thrilled with success after a heart-pounding, adrenaline-pumping scramble uphill against a hail of shot and shell, he assumed the day was won. His day, however, had only just begun. This is his Gettysburg story.
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. These fields are filled with stories. From the big units and the fights and the battles that happened out here, the death and destruction, everything, including the individual story of the soldiers that fought here and the civilians that suffered through the aftermath and the months of the stench of the dead. But today we're out here to tell a story about one of those soldiers that fought out here for the Confederate Army, the 20th Georgia. Is it any wonder that people leave items like this behind me here? It's a wreath for the 124th New York at the statue here just in front of the triangular field. Devil's Den is over here to my left-hand side. People come out here all the time and leave flowers, flags, coins, wreaths, various different things to show their respects to the men that fought out here, to the men that they don't even know. The reason behind it is because they have a personal connection somewhere deep down inside of them. The majority of the people that do that, they have ancestry that fought out here. And it's really no different in any other battlefield, but at this place, the connection seems to be just a little bit stronger. And maybe it's because of the drama that happened out here and unfolded on those 3 hot days in July. I'm in the shadows of the 124th New York right now to tell a story about a man named Pinky. Or at least that's what his nickname was back home in Georgia. Now, Pinky grew up in Georgia, and he probably never thought he'd ever see the Rocky Hills of a place like Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In those days, world traveler meant that if you lived in Columbus, somehow you got to Atlanta. Now you were an official world traveler. You went to the big city. Well, Pinky ends up here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and he gets in over his head real fast out here near Hawks Ridge and the triangular field. Now, he's no rookie when it comes to fighting. In 1861, he ends up leaving his town and joining the army for the Confederacy. He enlists and ends up leading Company E in the 20th Georgia. He ends up fighting in places such as Antietam. So he's been involved in some massive fights leading up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And sometimes, when the momentum is right, the battle turns and it changes. And a lot of these young leaders see that to mean that they're winning the fight, and they push their men as far as they can. Well, he got himself out here and got himself into a little bit of trouble because he used that emotion while he was fighting here at Gettysburg. Now, to give you a little bit of orientation where we're at right now, coming back around in this direction here, you can clearly see the rocks down below there. That's Devil's Den. Off behind the cannons in the distance, that's the little round top. The slaughter pen lays down below in the middle of all of that, and down below through here. Off in the distance over there, beyond that tree line, that's where the Confederate soldiers are coming from. And as they come through here, in this position of the talk that we're having today, we're talking about the 2nd Georgia, the 17th Georgia, the 20th Georgia, and the 15th Georgia of Bennings, as they're coming up through these fields. Right off out in that area over there, this area out in here, is that field known as the triangular field, or at least that's the beginning of it. The 20th is actually pushing up through that area and end up on the ridge line close to Hawks Ridge and out here at the Rocky Outcropping. So the men are kind of spread out all over when they come up through here. Hatchet across these fields over here. He's dressed his men off. He's gotten his marching orders. and he's getting them from Benning. Benning, after the war, admittedly said that he got his orders confused. He wasn't supposed to really be where he was at, but he ends up over here in this fight. Well, Hatchet is a little confused too. He gets his dander up. He's got his men fighting with him. And he's going across these fields, and things are seeming to be a little too easy. His company is charging with him. And as they go up across these rocky heights, he can see the enemy's cannon off in the distance. That becomes a target real quick. So they start to make their way towards that cannon. And off in the distance behind me, they had to traverse that field up in that area towards the rocky heights. Benning and his men are making pretty good work, pretty good progress out here. Hatchet, on the other hand, gets out ahead of the rest of the 20th and ends up coming across this field with his men. He gets up to the top of the rocky heights and then looks back. And he's right next to a boulder, much like the one right behind me here. It's not very large, but he gets on top of that boulder, egging his men on, and looks back at this position here and realizes he's a long way away from the main lines. They've been told to halt back down there. They have a position to fall back to where they're covering it. His men, however, are way up here. So to give you a reference point for how far away he is, Hatchet is where I'm at right now. And the rest of the men are back down there towards where that boulder is. And they're kind of lined up behind some rocks, halted, reforming, and trying to come up here in concentration towards the position. Hatchet's made a very big mistake, because as soon as he gets up to this ridgeline, off to the distance over here, the Union soldiers have lined up and they're starting to fire in his direction. And now he's taking enfilade fire right down the line of the men that he has here with him. And there's not very many in his group. Hatchet, sitting up on top of this boulder, realizes he has a big problem on his hands. Him and the handful of soldiers that are still with him, because the rest of them retreat back down the hill like smart individuals, him and the rest of those soldiers slide down the side of the big boulder like the one I'm standing on now. And as they get down there, Hatchet realizes there's not a lot of cover here. He can't stand upright. You're going to take a bullet to the head. So several of them crouch down behind this boulder and they get into hiding position as best they can. They're not very well covered on either side. The Union's firing at them from all sides. Hatchet's legs sticking out, and he takes a bullet to the foot, right there near the ankle. He can't come across this field. So now, with the rest of his men who have hightailed it back across to safety, they've left him out here. Hatchet's got to figure out what he's going to do from this point. Now, reenactors know what I'm talking about when I say you don't see very much when you're in the line of fire. Meaning that when the soldiers are lined up together and formed up for their fight, even if it's a pretend fight, they stick to the man to the left and to the right. And the officer that's in charge out front has to pay attention to the orders that are being given, the bugle calls, and the positions in front. And depending on how far up in rank they are concerned about only one thing, which is keeping the line straight and going in the direction that they've been told to go, keeping people in order. Well, they're probably not looking far off into the distance to see that Little Round Top is covered with soldiers. Hatchet records that when he got up here to the top where he was at in that boulder, he looked up and he could see Union troops swarming Little Round Top, and he didn't think that there were soldiers up there. So now he realizes he could be shot at from way up there on Little Round Top too. So he devises a plan to crawl back to the main lines that he was once at, and he's crawling across this field for dear life. But somehow he manages to make it back to the 20th Georgia. Hatchet would go on to live past this battle, and he would muster out in 1864. Hatchet's fiery rebel spirit isn't over with here at Gettysburg, and it doesn't end in 1864 either. He musters out of that army, makes his way back to home, and ends up in Texas. Ironically, he doesn't take that oath of allegiance until 1871, meaning he still considers himself a rebel right up until that point. He hasn't ceded the victory to the North just yet. But when he gets to Texas, he ends up becoming a school teacher at one point in time. He sold kerosene, he had a cattle business, and he would die in 1931 at the age of 92. He had a wife and 2 sons that survived him. His friends called him a rough old man, the ones that knew him the best. And he had a story here at Gettysburg to tell. And that's why we decided to tell it today. It was the tenacity and the fighting spirit of the men that came up on these fields and thought that they could take these rocks, that pushed the Union soldiers back as far as they did, that made this position look like it was going to fail. But on the flip side of that coin, it was the fighting spirit of those Union soldiers up here and their leadership that kept them in place, forced a conclusion to Gettysburg, and ultimately a conclusion to the Civil War, where the United States would be victorious and the Union would survive.
Hatchet served with the 20th Georgia until the autumn of 1864, which was the last time he was listed on the regimental rolls. At some point, he settled in Texas and avoided signing the oath of allegiance to the federal government until 1871. Most Confederate soldiers had signed within days and weeks of the surrender of the armies and collapse of the Confederate government. Hatchet taught school for a time, started a short-lived cattle business, and even sold kerosene. He lived until age 92, dying in 1931. He would often tell his story, his Gettysburg story, until the end. His wife and 2 sons survived him.
Many times on these fields, we tell stories about entire units. And in Malvern Hill, I told a story about the 9th Virginia coming across Malvern Hill, and the comparisons between that fight and Pickett's charge here at Gettysburg. And we talked about John Vermillion. Well, that's one of the individual stories that we're going to tell here today at Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg at Pickett's charge. in the shadows of Robert E. Lee today, out here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And no doubt, a lot of the Southern officers that fought with the Army of Northern Virginia probably felt as though they themselves were in the shadows of Robert E. Lee. Longstreet himself not able to commit to anything that he wanted to do out here because he had to follow orders. At least that's the way the story was told. The position I'm in right now is one of the artillery positions out here, just out in front of where the Robert E. Lee statue is at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And if you come out to this position here, you'll get a good understanding of how Pickett's charge actually started. Now, off in the distance behind me, right past where this cannon was, or is today, the men from Armistead's brigade were lined up, preparing to go into combat over here. This is how far out they were. The misconception is that the Confederate soldiers actually lined up back there where Robert E. Lee's statue is. The statue itself is supposed to be an indicator of where Lee rode out to speak to his men as they were coming back across this field, and where he uttered those famous words, "It is all my fault." Armistead's men was standing on this ridge where I'm standing right now, just behind these cannons. And they were preparing to walk into something that many of them had probably seen before at a place called Malvern Hill. Now it's time for my favorite thing, and probably yours too, a little battlefield orientation. If you look back in this direction here, you can see off in the distance, right over there, that is the Virginia Monument to Robert E. Lee. Way off in the distance over here, the North Carolina Monument sits in the tree lines over there. Now, when we're talking about the 9th and the 18th Virginia, so the 9th, we're telling the story about John Vermillion. Armistead's men are lined up right there where that patch of grass looks green. They're stretching all out in this direction here. And then when you come up to where this snake rail fence is, split rail fence, and you come just a little bit further past that, that's where the units of the 18th Virginia are. Now, out in this direction, Armistead's men are lined up as the 38th, the 57th, the 53rd, the 9th, and the 14th, anchoring it out in that direction there. Just out in front of them, about 100 yards or so, the 56th, the 28th Virginia, the 19th Virginia, then the 18th Virginia, followed by the 8th, which should be sitting out there on the road where the farm is, right out in this direction here. And then across that road is the 3rd Virginia, the 7th Virginia, 1st Virginia, 11th, and 24th. Back in this direction here, where the traffic is flowing, is Emmitsburg Road. This is the road that they're going to have to cross in order to get to center of the line. Right over here. Now, to recap some of the information about John, he came into the military in Portsmouth in 1861 with his brother Dennis. And they were with the Portsmouth Guards, who eventually turned into the 9th Virginia. And they fight the Peninsula Campaign, and they end up at Malvern Hill. John's brother is not so lucky. And even though he rises to the rank of captain before he dies, at the Battle of Malvern Hill, Dennis takes a massive wound to the chest and ends up dying there on the fields. John doesn't know that his brother is dying and continues to participate in the fight. But when he finally crawls back across those fields, he ends up finding his brother and realizes it's too late. The man's gone. Dennis is transported back to Portsmouth, and he's now buried there today, where his graveside monument is. And there are many articles in the newspaper you can find that talks about the heroism of Dennis. John's story is told in a couple of books, and it's mostly related to the battle here at Gettysburg and Pickett's charge. Off directly over my shoulders here, where that wood line is, the 9th Virginia and Armistead, and that brigade that we talked about that was stepping off from Malvern Hill, they're stepping out here behind Garnett. And they're about to go across this field. But this field looks massively different than Malvern Hill. The hills are much bigger. The rolling plains are very different. Now, Malvern Hill, they hadn't been to Antietam yet. 9th Virginia hadn't seen that. They hadn't seen this northern plains and the northern rolling hills up here in Pennsylvania and Maryland. When you get up here and you take a look at this place for yourself, it looks vastly different. Well, by the time he gets up here, he's no longer a sergeant. He's a second lieutenant, and he's in charge of his company with a first lieutenant. And they're going to go across these fields with soldiers directly in front of me to that stone wall and try to take out the Union soldiers that are on the other side and break the Union Army in two. Now, as John Vermillion steps off here at Gettysburg from that tree line that we talked about earlier, and he's headed towards his destination, he gets an urgent request from a private that's in his unit. Now, if you recall, we talked about Vermillion's kindness. In 1855, when he was just 19 years old, he risked his life helping all of the fever patients in Portsmouth. And many people credit him with saving their lives. Well, he doesn't change. And here at Gettysburg, this young private comes up to him and his co-leader there, and the other lieutenant, and he begs and pleads them, please, I've had a premonition. I think I'm going to die in this charge. Now, the first lieutenant dismisses the request and says it's plain silliness, because they are facing sudden death. They're soldiers here on these fields, and they have to do their duty. You have to cross these fields. Your request is denied. You will get back in the ranks. The moment that that first lieutenant says that, John Vermillion steps in and says, First Lieutenant, this man is a brave man. I've seen him on many battlefields. He has fought hard, and he has fought bravely. I have never seen him waver. I have never seen him act like this before. I think that we should grant him this request, this one time. First Lieutenant turns to him and looks at him and says, absolutely not. There's not a man in my ranks that's going to stand down from this fight. And if he decides to run, he will deal with the consequences. So the young man gets back in line, and they march off to their fate. Now, as they're stepping in formation, Private Brinkley's, first name Mills, is back in line, and they're marching. And to the head of them is that first lieutenant and second lieutenant John Vermillion. They're about 20 paces into marching across these fields when a bullet comes up and hits him right in the face. Private Brinkley's goes to the ground. They get a little bit further, closer to the Emmitsburg Road. That first lieutenant takes a shell to the face. Both of those men go down in this field, and they both die. So the premonition comes true. The ironic thing is, had the first lieutenant allowed him to bow out, which it wasn't unheard of in those times, they did allow things such as that. Had the first lieutenant allowed that, the private would have at least survived this battle. The first lieutenant, maybe his positioning might have been a little bit differently, and maybe he would have survived all the way up to the wall. But who knows? At either rate, they both died. And John Vermillion lives on to tell that story to many people. John Vermillion makes it across that road, and he marches into the face of hell with Armistead, right on the other side there at the stone wall. But that's where his Civil War ends. John Vermillion is taken prisoner of war just across that wall, not too many paces from where Armistead's laying after being wounded. And he ends up being transferred to a prisoner of war camp. Now just imagine what must have been going through John Vermillion's mind when he's standing in this position I'm in now. I can see the stone wall in front of me, the angle, and I'm about to go up and over that stone wall. And as I get over the top, they're at a trot here. They're running as fast as they can to try to break these lines. Low Armistead's got his hat on a sword, and he's off to my right-hand side. You can see him just over there. Imagine. And as we're coming up over this stone wall, at a trot, cannons are still firing. The men are starting to get a little uneasy over here because they can see us coming at them. And then I make my way up these stones, up to the top, and as I get up here, I look directly in front of me and I see that Armistead has advanced about 100 feet in front of me, and he goes down. He's blasted. Fight is over. I'm looking all around me. My ranks are decimated. I don't think there's any way for us to continue to fight. So as I'm here, it's either put my arms up in the air, stick my club up, and surrender to the men around me and hope they don't kill me, or try to make my way back across this field, way back over there, to where that Virginia monument is, back to my lines of safety, because there's nothing across this field is going to prevent me from getting shot in my back as I'm going across. So he does what any logical person would do, and he gives himself up here, right where Armistead is injured. And Armistead would end up dying as a result of his injuries, but Vermillion would be a prisoner of war. So for John Vermillion, this is it. Right there is where Armistead goes down. Somewhere out here in this field where I'm standing right now, John Vermillion is taken captive. This march is over for him. This battle is over for him. And the Confederates are going back across this field. What's left of them, of that 15,000 that came across this field, they're straggling back. There's no support coming, and there's no way that they're going to win this battle. Eventually those armies go on, meet again and again, and death would continue. Finally, in 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia gives up. Robert E. Lee quits. And after that, all the other forces in the field start to lay their arms down. That's the end of the American Civil War. John Vermillion is transferred to Johnson's Island. And then shortly after he's there, he ends up at Fort Delaware. Now, if you know anything about either one of these places, they are nearly as bad as Andersonville. The starvation rate is pretty bad. Soldiers are dying from sickness and starvation there all the time. So those camps are terrible. And no matter what books you read in whatever context, don't let them fool you. Every single prisoner of war camp during the American Civil War was absolutely atrocious. The Andersonville camp stands out because only one person was held accountable, really, for their actions. And that was Henry Wurz. John Vermillion would live through the Civil War. He would go back to Portsmouth and would be unmarried. He would open up a liquor store there and live out the rest of his days talking at veterans camps about his time in the war and here at Gettysburg.
I had no alternative but to order the regiment in. We had no force on hand to meet the sudden emergency. Troops had been ordered up and were coming on the run, but I saw that in some way 5 minutes must be gained or we were lost. It was fortunate that I found there so grand a body of men as the 1st Minnesota. I knew they must lose heavily, and it caused me pain to give the order for them to advance, but I would have done it even if I had known every man would be killed. It was a sacrifice that must be made. The superb gallantry of those men saved our line from being broken. General Winfield Scott Hancock.
Just as the sun comes up out here this morning in Gettysburg, we're out at the site of the 1st Minnesota, so that we can tell the story of the 1st Minnesota and one of the soldiers that fought out here at Gettysburg and was wounded. We're also going to try to peel back that story a little bit because it doesn't quite unfold the way a lot of people like to tell it. Minnesota's not the only group out here that's helping in this position. They're just the ones that got the credit because it's a very dramatic story. And that's what people like. They like the drama. Those are the kind of stories I like to talk about. So hopefully we shed some light and bring something new to you here, Gettysburg. Before we can dispel any of the rumors or talk to any of the other action that happened out here on the field with the 1st Minnesota, we'll get into talking about a soldier that was a part of that unit. And then we'll go into a little bit more detail as to what exactly unfolded out here with the 1st Minnesota and how they ended up being involved in the way that they were. The slaughter that happened with that unit, the amount of casualties, quite frankly, was just a result of a mismatch between the sides of units. They ran headlong into the Alabamians out here on this field. There's no doubt in that. Everybody reported that. And Hancock himself knew that he was sending that unit to slaughter. He said so much. But the story that's here is about the individuals that make up the 262. And we'll talk about one of those individuals who got wounded almost immediately once he started going into the fight. Orderly Sergeant Matthew Marvin from Winona joins a war effort in 1861. He ends up being wounded twice in combat. The first time he gets wounded happens at the Battle of Bull Run. The second time is in the Peninsula Campaign. He's then wounded a subsequent third time because one of his fellow soldiers accidentally shoots him in the thigh. So the man's not been very lucky. But he heals up. He's out here on these fields in Gettysburg. And the 1st Minnesota are in the fields directly behind me there. they're down on the ground, kind of waiting to get into the action. And Hancock's out here, and he starts to see the gap across the field here. Realizes Alabama's about to push through, and that once they get through and push through, they are going to split his line and create a major problem. Hancock rides up, and according to what most people say, asks Minnesota if they see those flags. And they reply, yes, they do. And Hancock says, well, then go take them. And Minnesota, with a yell, streams across this field in a fury to take those flags. 262 men versus a brigade. Now, if you know anything about the sizes of units, then you know how much of a mismatch that is. Brigade's a very large mass of men. 262 men, it's not a lot. They're not going to do a whole lot against that brigade. But what they are going to do is they're going to buy time. Precious time, so that more men can be maneuvered around. And they do that successfully. But they do so at the cost of their own men. Because barely over 40 men make it out of that fight without something severe happening to them. That's an 80% casualty rate here on this field. Marvin's one of them. In order to better understand the story out here, we have to be in this position to show you where everything is. So Minnesota's down there, and across this field's where Alabama's going to be coming from. The reason why they're in the pickle that they're in right now in the first place is because of Dan Sickles. Down there in that position is Dan Sickles' headquarters. Dan Sickles' men are supposed to be lined up down this way here towards Little Round Top to protect that flank, to be the end of the line. Instead, his men are pushed out here towards the Sherfy Peach Orchard. There is a high ridge over there just beyond the trees that he's considered to be extremely important. So he has his men out there at a salient. And in order to support Dan Sickles, Humphreys has to be removed from this position here and positioned at the Wheatfield, because the fight back there is about to turn for the worse. Because of that, there is now a gap in the line here, and Alabama's about to pour through that gap. Hancock, being the good soldier he is on horseback, is riding around out here and paying attention to all points. And he can see what's unfolding in front of him. That's when he runs up to Minnesota and he asks them to get into the fight. But what that ignores is, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Freeman McGilvery. His battery was masked from retiring cannons from Sickles' front near the Peach Orchard. And they covered the withdrawal of Humphrey's men, establishing his guns on a shelf on a high ground about halfway between the Trossel Farm and the crest of Cemetery Ridge. So the type of firepower that they were getting from him also assisted in the situation to keep the Alabamians back. You had other units that were out here helping to keep the Alabamians back from this position. The 5th U.S. Artillery was definitely one of the main reasons why Alabama didn't come all the way across that field and just run over top the 262 men of Minnesota. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. So now there's time for some battlefield orientation here, everybody's favorite. I'll put the map up on the screen after I'm done talking about the positioning, and then I'll run through it a second time. So off out in my front here, Plum Run runs down through here in this position. And we'll go over there and get some film of that too to add to the video so you can see Plum Run. But Plum Run's running down through there. And coming up through Plum Run is the 17th Mississippi, starting off in this direction over here. 17th Mississippi, the 13th Mississippi, the 18th Mississippi. Falling further into the back out there, we're looking at the 8th Alabama, then the 10th Alabama, setting up shop over here, followed by the 11th Alabama, 14th, and the 9th Alabama. And their positions are running along this area over here, directly out in front of where 1st Minnesota goes into the fight. Back here, if you listen to the story word for word, it makes it sound like this entire field is empty, and the only people here to save the day is the 1st Minnesota. Simply not true. The 125th New York, 126th New York, and the 111th New York are actually out here on this field, and they're fighting in the direction of the 18th, 13th, and 17th Mississippi. They're also supporting the fight against the 8th Alabama and the 10th Alabama. So there's a small gap there between the 111th and the 1st Minnesota. That small gap is where the 10th Alabama, 11th, and the 14th decide that they're going to try to get through that gap and break the lines. And when we're talking about the gap, we're talking about this football field space that's in between here, as Alabama's coming across these fields. Now, just imagine you're one of the soldiers out here on this field, and you're with Minnesota. You know how small your unit is, and you know what you're capable of. Especially Marvin, he's been around for a long time. He's been with Minnesota for a while, and he's been in most of the conflicts out here in the Eastern Theater. Look across that field behind me there. Today, it's kind of hard to imagine. There's cars running up and down the street, cars running up and down this field in my front. And no one can really imagine the amount of men that would have been coming across this field. The battle lines are drawn behind us. It's a long, stretched out line of infantry. The Alabamians are coming on strong. They're ready. They're going to get to this position and break this line if they can. You're standing here as a soldier, and you hear that rebel yell pouring across this field as those men are making their way over here. Put yourself in that man's position. That Minnesotan is probably feeling very anxious at the least. At the worst, the fear is in his guts, and he doesn't know if he's going to live or die. So now Marvin and his men let out a yell, and they're about to charge across this field towards Alabama into certain death. At least that's what one of them said. they knew that they were headed towards death. Just as Marvin starts to run, somehow a bullet drives across the field low enough that it hits him in the front of his foot, and it goes through his large toe, down the bottom of the foot, and blasts out the back of his heel. It takes off a huge portion of his shoe and the heel of his shoe. He falls to the ground and looks at his foot, and he sees that big chunk of leather missing, and then the blood is just oozing out of his boot. Well, looking up, realizing that his men have just left him behind, he wanted to catch up with them and be a part of the fight. So he gets on his feet, even though he's badly wounded, and he tries to run to catch up to them. And he gets to right about where they're at and is trying to get into the fight. But then the blood loss, the excitement of the moment, causes him to black out, and he falls down flat on his face. Now, while the fighting and the melee is happening all around him, and the 1st Minnesota is pushed out even further from where they're at when he was on the ground, he rolls over on his back, he grabs his canteen, and he takes himself a big drink of water. And he looks up at the position behind me here, across those fields, and sees the fight. And he realizes he can't get out there anymore. He's not well enough to do it. So he rolls back over on his stomach, gets to his feet, and he tries to walk back across that field directly behind me to get back over here to the main lines. He gets a little bit into the walk, and then he falls down again, and he realizes he's not going to make it. He crawls across this ground to where I'm at, over here on this side, and gets back to safety on his main line. That wound stops him from fighting, and it pretty much effectively ends his fight during the American Civil War. He would not be able to fight anymore. He's too badly wounded. In this war, there are really a couple things you need. You need to be able to pull the trigger, you need to be able to walk, and you have to have at least 2 teeth to bite the end of a cartridge so that you could pour the powder down the end of that barrel. Well, he doesn't have his feet anymore. He's badly wounded as a result of the fight here at Gettysburg. Can you hear the sound of the guns out here on these fields when you walk these fields? Imagine the fight all around you. That's the kind of thing that inspires me out here. To know that these men standing these lines, realizing that they may not get to go back home to their children, to their wives, to their mothers and fathers. And being so young, their future, it could end in a moment at any field. And they wouldn't know if that would end in victory or if that would end in defeat. The only thing that they had was hope. I'm now headed into the position of Minnesota right now, where their statue is. So Marvin ends up discharged June of 1864 because of his injury. And he's married to a woman named Angeline. He has a couple of kids, and he goes on to be a superintendent of a cemetery in Winona. That same cemetery today is where he's buried, in Winona. He was a fighting man out here with Minnesota. Minnesota sent 262 of their best into the fight. And out of that 262, 215 of them would be casualties. Casualty rate of over 80%. And that's the story of Marvin out here in Gettysburg. For all of Marvin's efforts and the rest of Minnesota, everything turns out okay. The fight out here unfolds exactly the way the generals really planned on the Union side. They defended their territory, even though they gave up some of their ground on July 2nd, and they were able to stop the Confederates from completely rolling up their lines. Coming across these fields, Alabama was on a tear. So was Mississippi. Mississippi, specifically the 13th, had pushed Dan Sickles' men over a half a mile from their positions, originally over on the Peach Orchard. Alabama was coming across that Emmitsburg Road and making a run for it over here. It was amazing what was going on at that time. And without groups, units, like Minnesota, the line surely would have been split in half. And the Confederates could have fought on the flank of either position here at Cemetery Hill. And once one portion of that line breaks, that's the end of it. They have to reposition and move again. And who knows, Gettysburg on July 2nd may have turned into the Confederate victory that Robert E. Lee was looking for. But Marvin and Minnesota made sure that that didn't happen. As I walk over here to Father Corby to get my blessing as I'm wrapping up my videos here at Gettysburg for the series, I can't help but think of these monuments and the positions around these fields as more than just position markers. When you go to a cemetery, there are monuments all over the place. Those monuments are individual monuments to the people and the lives that they lived. They can't put their entire lives on one stone tablet. All they can do is put their dates of living and a few kind words for the individual that it was dedicated to. These monuments here packed as much information on it as it possibly could, and they're dedicated to the people that fought here and to the people that died here. This is their cemetery. Earlier we said we were going to put the map back up on the screen so that you can kind of take a look at what we were talking about here on the field in front of us with Minnesota. So that's a Minnesota monument right over there with a man standing on top running or charging towards the field. and they're headed out generally in this direction over here. Right out where this bramble and bushes and all that stuff is over there. Now, we're in a different position than we were last time, so this is going to line up a little bit better for you. So I'll go ahead and put that map up on the screen now. The 9th Alabama, starting from the right, the 9th Alabama, the 14th Alabama, the 11th Alabama, and the 10th Alabama is under Wilcox. And you can see that they're in front of Plum Run. You see the jetted out trees there. So that's what we're looking at, right? Going directly behind that, you can see the 8th Alabama moving on to the left. And beside that, the 18th Mississippi, 13th Mississippi, and the 17th Mississippi, all under William Barksdale. They are facing, if you look back towards the Union side on the left-hand side, the 125th New York, the 126th New York, 111th New York. Then there's a gap in between, and that's where you see the 1st Minnesota on this map. Now, this map comes directly out of a field guide to Gettysburg. And we will take the map off the screen now so that you can see the positions. So starting with the 9th Alabama, we're working from this direction over. This is what we're talking about here. And then off in this direction over here is where Mississippi is coming from. Right out in that direction there. We're on Cemetery Ridge, where New York is supporting off in this direction here. Then there's a gap that's in between. As you can see, New York would be out in here. And the gap is in between here, leading up to Minnesota. Minnesota is trying to plug this very large gap here and slow down the men that are coming across this field. And the artillery pieces that are over here are also plugging the gap as well. And they are firing upon the men as they're coming across this wide open field. It was a bloody affair out here for sure. Now, I'm no expert out here at the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm probably just like you. I've read enough on it, studied enough on it, love the place. I come out here often, and I learn something new every time, like Minnesota. In studying this, I learned a little bit more about the fight here and the support that they had going into this fight, and that it wasn't just Minnesota winning the day. But if you really want to get a feel for everything out here, I highly suggest that you go get a tour from one of the professional guides at the National Park Station. Hire one of those guides, certified and licensed. They know this field like the back of their hand. They have many programs built, and they can tell you these stories out here with a lot more accuracy and a lot more detail than what I can give you with these videos. I use them often myself in helping me come up with the plans for these videos. They lay the blueprint, and I just follow it. Go check them out. Well, just like all good things must come to an end, so must this trip here at Gettysburg. I've had a great time out here telling these stories of these soldiers on these fields. And within a 24-hour period, I've managed to put in a lot of work. So I have a lot of good stories coming up for you here on the channel. I hope you take something from these videos, and it gives you more to see the next time you come out here at Gettysburg. And when you get out here, tell those stories to other people. Pass them along so that they know about Marvin and the 1st Minnesota and the other soldiers that we talk about out here on these fields. It's been great. Until next time, it's History with Waffles.
With his hopes for a successful invasion of the North shattered, Lee awaited a Union counterattack on July 4th, which never materialized. That night, amid heavy rain, the Confederate general retreated with his battered army toward Virginia. The Union emerged victorious at Gettysburg. Although Meade faced criticism for not pursuing Lee after the battle, Gettysburg represented a devastating defeat for the Confederacy. Union casualties reached 23,000, while the Confederates suffered approximately 28,000 losses, over a third of Lee's forces. The North celebrated, while the South mourned, its aspirations for foreign recognition of the Confederacy dashed.